Okay, thank you, Jillian. I think before I start, I'd just like to say that when we timetabled the seminars, we didn't know that we were going to coincide with a fairly major industrial action or march against higher education cuts. So I'd actually seriously considered postponing the seminar to another date, but decided since it was had been publicized for so long that we'd continue to go on with it. So I know some of my colleagues are marching down to Royal Avenue as we speak. So perhaps they'll tune in and see this when it's streamed. So I'm talking really about something that is quite a different project from ARK. It's a European Commission Framework 7 research project, what they call a collaborative project. By that they mean projects where you have a number of teams strung across different countries in Europe working together. And the title of the project has been Euro-Identities. Its full title is Euro-Identities, the Evolution of European Identity, using biographical methods to study the development of European identity. And the project itself has a fairly long history. It really before the Framework 7 came into existence, a number of colleagues were interested in using biographical methods to study European identity. And in fact, there had been an application under Framework 6 with some of the people that came to partners that was not successful. And at that stage, we decided to play a waiting game and to see what were the calls in Framework 7, and then if there was a suitable slot to put in a bid. We actually had way back in 2005, we had a seminar in Belfast where we talked about the sort of the conceptual issues that might underlie the project. But as luck would have it, it was questions of identity, and particularly European identity, did come in quite prominently in the Framework 7 call. So we put in a bid and we were successful. I think sometimes it was quite, everything, the politics always comes into getting research funding sometimes. And it was quite odd that I think practically everyone on the project, I think you could say, our basic political orientation, personal orientation, would be fairly pro-Europe, Eurocentric. I wouldn't think we wouldn't call us Eurosceptics by any means. But at the same time, as we were going through the application process and being evaluated, sometimes bad news that would come out about the failure of the European Constitution to be ratified, or then the Irish pitching in and voting against European unification every chance they got, was sort of in an ironic kind of way good news for us, because I think it did help focus the Commission's mind about they perhaps have a problem about people's identification with Europe. But at any rate, we were successful. The project now is moving into its final stages. The actual funding ceased at the end of February, but now we're in the throes of writing up. There's quite a lot of writing going on, both as teams and by individuals scattered around the various teams. So it's coming along. The website, I don't know if you can, it's a bit difficult to see, but it's www.euroidentities.org. And this is the main sort of location of material as it becomes available. We have some working papers up now, and there's quite a lot literally has come in over the last few weeks. So there'll be more material going up progressively over the spring and into the summer. So a bit about the project itself. It's using what's called the biographical narrative approach as its main means of getting an insight into the active processes of forming European identities. It's 7 research teams scattered fairly strategically across Europe. We have teams both from Western and Eastern Europe, from the accession states, from large countries such as Germany and Poland, and from countries for instance, Italy located in the south, Northern Ireland, Wales located, which you might call the sort of Western periphery, and then amongst the other accession states, Estonia is a fairly prosperous accession state in contrast to Bulgaria, which is less prosperous. So we do have a good scatter, I think, for the kind of issues we're interested in. The method itself, unstructured biographical narrative interviewing, was a deliberate choice. I think it's more a matter of the method matching the research problem, rather than sometimes is the case where research problems are sort of forced to fit in with one's favorite method. Just to say a little bit about how biographical narrative interviewing works. It's a very unstructured form of qualitative research. Typically, it is the first stage is that the person being interviewed is asked to give the story of their life in as unstructured, open way as possible. The various, really the interviewers try as much as possible to not affect what the person chooses to tell you. So they ideally, after a single sort of eliciting question, ask someone to please tell us your life story, the person will launch into a fairly lengthy narrative, story of their life. They range quite a lot in length, but I'd say probably typically they're about 40 minutes. Some people finish sooner, and I've known people who've done this sort of research talking about interviews that have lasted 4 hours or longer. So they can be quite long, but say typical length about 40 minutes. This first stage, the interviewer interjects as little as possible, just sort of is passive. The person's been told that the interviewer is not really going to ask any active questions at this point, just wants to hear the story as they want to tell it. And then classically what happens at the second stage is you move into we call it the interrogative stage, but at the first step would be that you should attempt as much as possible only to ask questions about matters that the interviewee has raised themselves in the interview. And the idea of this, sometimes the Germans use a phrase to preserve the Gestalt, preserve the spirit of the interview, so that you really are focusing in and getting more information on things that they have elected to at least begin to tell you. There may be particular questions where you want more information, or there may be something that the project is interested in that they've begun to allude to, but you'd like to hear more about. And then finally, if necessary, then there's a third stage where you maybe move into more sort of a classical sort of semi-structured direct questioning. There may be particular items that you want to know about that they haven't raised, and you have to just ask straight questions. And this technique, the idea is, since we are really, in some ways, the project was sort of a fishing exercise. We wanted to know what people themselves thought about their sense of identification with Europe and thought about Europe. And it's, rather than try to impose preconceptions on people, to give them as maximum play as possible, to give their own version of what they felt about Europe. And I think, I'll say a little bit later on, I think it worked quite well. One of the things we also knew from piloting pre-testing interviews beforehand, if you just pull someone off the street and ask them to tell their life story, the odds that they're going to talk about Europe at any length is pretty minimal. Unless you're particularly if you're just picking an average person. If you pick a sort of an elite person, it might be different. And so there was this sort of we realized that if we just sort of randomly pick people, we'd end up with a lot of information, but perhaps very little about Europe. So we do have this strategy of concentrating on what we call sensitized groups. People whose life experience can anticipate it in one way or another to have raised issues in their life experiences that would cause them to at least think about Europe or question whether they are European or if they are European. I'll say a bit more about those in a minute. The scale of the project is also interesting in that each team did about 10 autobiographical narrative interviews for each sensitized group with which they were involved. And there are around about 230 interviews in sum. All of them quite lengthy, in-depth, unstructured interviews. That's a very large number. Many qualitative projects get by with 15, 20, 25 interviews. And the scale of this has been quite an organizational issue for us. I didn't really realize how much we were collecting until one day I thought about the number of pages if you typed all the interviews out, and realized that it would, on a kitchen table, it would be about 2 or 3 feet thick sheets of paper. It would have been a huge just bulk of paper if it was anything other than digital form. So it's a large scale project. And I'll say a bit more about the sensitized groups now. We had a lot of debate about what these groups are going to be. I wish I'd kept notes about the ones we rejected. because these are the ones we eventually settled on. There were 5 original groups that we concentrated upon. One of these was what we call transnational workers, people whose life experiences include either working or having had worked at some point in another European country from the one that they originate, so that they have lived abroad, they've had the experience of working. And this was both what we would call both sort of high-end workers, such as professionals, business entrepreneurs, fairly elite people, but also so-called low-end workers, people who traveled to do menial labor, quite mundane jobs. So we had across the board. The idea being that their experience of living in a different country and working in a different country would have given them causes to question who they were and their relationship to different people. A second group are what we call the educationally mobile. These were people who had had experience, a significant experience of an educational exchange arrangement at some time during their schooling, but not people who actually were still students themselves. People, the typical age would have been someone in their late 20s or 30s, someone who had been on something like an Erasmus exchange in the 90s and now was well into adulthood. And the basic idea was to see whether these experiences had had a lasting effect and what sort of lasting effect they would have had. Are they just a nice semester's holiday in a pleasant place with some friends that you think about pleasantly for the rest of your life, or have they actually had a different, more profound effect that stayed with you all your life? Another group, which I'll use a bit for my demonstration later, were the farmers. Several teams in particular were interested in farmers, and the argument being that farmers, even though they're not, almost by definition, not geographically mobile, are forced to think about Europe because of the subsidies, European markets, regulations, and the like. I was kind of doubtful about them, but in fact they've been a very fruitful group and a good contrast group to the others. And two other groups we had were what we call cultural contacts, a particular kind of transnational worker, people involved in activities that involve cultural contacts across borders. The original idea had been to have both high culture and low culture, looking at things like musicians who travel. One of the partners' husbands was a head of Eurovision, light entertainment in his local country and was in charge of Eurovision. So we thought we had an in into Eurovision there. It didn't quite work out that way. We sort of narrowed down and we focused more on people developing educational material, textbooks and the like cross-cultural tactics. But this was a particular group. Again, the idea being that people would have to think about European culture if they're trying to communicate. Another group has been, we call them civil society organizations, basically non-governmental organizations that have a European dimension. Again, because of the regulations that the Commission is a major source of funding. And the two groups we concentrated on were peace and reconciliation groups, both here in Northern Ireland, but also particularly on the German-Polish border, World War II reconciliation groups. Because again, the question of crossing borders, the other civil society organization we concentrated on were environmental organizations, because one of the basic tenets of environmentalism is environmental problems and issues transcend borders. And so these were the groups. I also need to mention that these were our original 5 groups. We developed 2 others during the course of the project. One of these, we call them intimate relations and then external to Europe. The intimate relations group was that very quickly in the early interviews, the analyses, we realized that a feature that was coming up again and again in many of the interviews where people really had some sense of identification with Europe, or where there really had been identity changes, was not so perhaps because of their cross-border experience, but more the relationships they had formed, where they had close personal relationships with people from another country, or in fact were also were themselves the product of a cross-national partnership. a good example of a person from here was a man I interviewed who had been at one of the Northern Irish universities, had done an Erasmus exchange abroad, was very reluctant to go, but decided he would. Met an Italian girl on his Erasmus exchange, returned, finished his degree, pursued her back to Italy, and now works in a very well-paid job in Italy with an Italian wife. And as he said, people asked if I ever came back when I came back from Erasmus, I have to say I never came back. And he's not joking. The contrast between his life, if he hadn't met this girl, and what it has been, is basically due to that one particular encounter. And then finally, the last extra group we added was what we call the External to Europe. Again, from many of the interviews, one thing that came out very clearly was that we realized we had tending to neglect people who had come into Europe from outside. Then they, as a group, raise particular kinds of problems. People don't necessarily fit with the stereotype of a European. They're dark-skinned. They might have non-Christian cultural origins. There's a lot of questioning, sometimes direct challenging and prejudice they have to face that's different in quality as well as quantity from someone born within Europe. And then also, some of the people we interviewed, as transnational workers, had sometimes worked outside of the continent altogether, and they had a particular kind of experience of living in a society other than a European society, and how people reacted to them. This sometimes would cause them, many people would say, the first time they felt they were European is when they were living this far abroad and realized that they were seen as European, they weren't seen as German or British, they were European. So these things affect. So we added these two extra sensitized groups. Another feature of your identities is a very strong policy orientation. European Commission doesn't really fund pure research, it funds applied research. We had a number of deliberate features to promote the dissemination and policy impact of the project. Some of these are fairly standard, such as disseminating information. We had our seminars, our interim conference, and our last conference took place in Brussels, deliberately located there in order to promote the involvement of people involved in policy making or trying to affect policy in the European Commission. We had the fantastic, terrible luck of having our first Brussels meeting during the middle of the volcanic travel disruption, which produced an experience I never care to remember. But we had both meetings there. It proved quite difficult to get people involved, but we did have them there. The other thing perhaps we did that was a bit different is we decided from the outset that we would have what we called lay essays, that we would try to communicate the project results in ways that were not the usual academic outputs. And there were four. One was a lay-friendly conceptual essay. Particularly the Italian colleagues took the lead in attempting to summarize the project results in a way that a person who's not a social scientist would understand. They did very well with this, very hard task. The other two essays, one was material that taken really mainly from the Educational Mobility Group, where they've produced sort of a summary of the project that is targeted upon people who are involved in international student exchanges, such as Erasmus offices. This can be very effectively disseminated because the Commission has central registrations and we can get the information out. Another particular group was concentrated upon was the civil society organizations, where there is a policy document about really I suppose the way to sum it up would be the psychological effects upon working in something like a civil society organization. It's again, we could target a group there because in the process of producing the people who attended the meetings in Brussels, we came across a number of circulation lists, including sort of civil society organizations that are recognized by the European Commission. So we have a good circulation list there. But that takes me on to the fourth lay essay. This was quite different. Originally, it was to do with the media. I chose to take this very broadly and produce something which I would call an audiovisual essay. I decided that an essay does not necessarily have to have a physical paper presence. And so what is being generated is really a virtual essay, an attempt to display the results of the project in a way other than on paper. My original idea, part of it was just a feeling from the interviews that often that the voice of the interviewees, you could say, is almost like a voice of agency. People having to deal with life, reporting what they did, the things they went through, the trials, the tribulations, the victories. And a lot of this you could sort of juxtapose it against the sort of structure world that they had to do this in, the opportunities or lack of opportunities they had, things they had to cope with. And one of the original ideas was that the agency would be shown in the voices of the interviewees, and this could be contrasted with images that would represent structure. This kind of broke down. We actually began to put it into effect, but it was one of the ideas. It was really kind of an idea that to try to convey this sort of experience of biographical interviewing and analysis. And it's an experiment. So once I began to do this, a lot of different sorts of issues come up, and I put these into 4 categories: ethical, conceptual, organizational, and instrumental. So I'll just go through these quickly and then move to a brief sort of demonstration of how the essay is going to be formed when it becomes finished and available. So ethical issues, people in the social sciences know that ethics is something that has always been an issue, but it's probably come more to the fore in the last couple of decades. I think sometimes you could say that probably you could almost sum up all ethical issues under the sort of a version of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm to your research subjects. But particular issues that I think that came up that affected this particular idea of a virtual essay was informed consent, ownership and exploitation, and confidentiality. Because the original idea I had for depicting the results was what I call vignettes, that a lot of the interviews would have particular sort of brief narrative stories within them that were good examples of particular types of pressures or things that had happened to a lot of people, but some people giving particularly good stories. And the original idea was that I could use these, take a fairly lengthy narrative exposition and have this as the audio and then match it up with photographs depicting what was being told. And in the end, this was rejected because, in fact, you run into lots of ethical problems if you think about doing this and putting it up on the web. One, I think, for instance, informed consent. I think people had consented to being interviewed and to their material being used and reproduced, but not really for a mini story based upon their life appearing on the web. And I think we were maybe moving a bit beyond what people had given informed consent to. There was, I think, the problem of ownership and exploitation that, again, this might be going a bit too far with using a particular individual's life story. And then finally, I think one of the main issues as well was confidentiality. If you show a vignette, it is bound to contain detail, and it might contain enough to where an individual could be identified, or certainly where they might recognize that this is their story that's being shown on the web. And I think the real problem that bothered us was more the problem of not doing any harm. I'm pretty sure, in fact, I knew in some cases, because people told me verbally they were quite happy if a vignette from their interview appeared on the web, was that happy stories would be quite well received, but we have many stories that aren't happy stories. They're stories about tragedies, great tribulations, scandals, and I think the greatest potential for damage was that sometimes I think people had given us an interview where they saw something in their life as positive, but perhaps when you analyzed it and thought about the implications of what they saw positively, maybe there was a net less positive interpretation. And I think if we put that up and someone realized that we had a different opinion about something they saw as positively, could have had a very bad effect. So anyway, these were rejected. And we opted for what I call isolated quotes instead. Very short quotes. Now, this, I think, gets around all those ethical problems, but it does bring its own costs. You lose the rapport because you don't really have a story. You just have a particular quote from a disembodied person. Loss of context and a sort of soundbite tendency. And as later on I come on, I think what it did also require was, because the context had been lost, you had to have a little bit of explanation as to why this particular quote was being shown. And so you needed a bit of narrative overlay. And I sort of jokingly call this the voice of God, because really, who is this individual that sort of knows everything, who intones? So you need a bit of narration. But to move on, conceptual issues, I think this is the point really being that they may not be visible, but there is some structure there. What sort of structure to put on all these quotations sitting there and images? They're basically this sort of, you might sort of a multi-dimensional grid, what I've opted for. The original 5 plus the 2 new sensitized groups forms part of the structure. We have some overarching concepts of domains, such as some ideas of dimensions that we created about sort of where you might identify European identity. There's an idea of European mental space. The kicker really has been, or the catch-22, is how to put all these together into a coherent single framework, and the realization that you really can't begin to put the material together until you get at least some sort of general idea of the whole structure. So you had to get an idea of the whole structure of the findings of the project at a time when the project wasn't finished yet. So there was a lot of work to do this. Organizational issues, how to identify significant findings, and then how to put them in the framework. We had 7 independent research teams working along evolving, but not necessarily completely parallel lines. There are actually quite a lot of differences between different parts of national research cultures across Europe. So there were issues such as what are, or are there overarching findings or conclusions that apply across the board? Can you translate, particularly say, particular sorts of findings that warrant a sensitized group across to another? Do they really translate? Because sometimes the people had different phraseology but seem to be describing the same sorts of findings. And then finally, well, we do have conflicting interpretations. How do you reach consensus between them? So these are sort of issues, organizational issues that we've been dealing with. Instrumental issues, a lot of these, it's just a set of little sort of problems, I suppose. One is how to find and choose the quotes you're going to use. Sometimes I call them the essential quote in the original term of essential, in the sense of essence. Like if you do qualitative analysis, often there'll be certain things some people say, you say that really sums up a particular finding for lots of people. So how to identify these essential quotes, and thank God for PowerPoint. We have had the project has been regularly presenting its results at conferences, and then our format of our own workshops has been where the teams come in and present PowerPoints of where they've gotten to so far. These would often include quotations, ideal quotations to represent certain points. So I've been able to mine these PowerPoints. And now that we've been into writing, it's the same sort of format that people talk about particular quotes as illustrative. So I can use the quotes. And then sometimes it also means just some of the interviews I'm particularly familiar with. I've been able to go back and find particular things that people have said that are useful. How to present the quotes. Here, it would have been, we could have done it, but it would have been quite instrumentally difficult to go back to the original audio files and extract the quotation spoken in the person's own voice. It, in some ways, would have been a problem that 5/7 of the interviews are in languages other than English. So what we have done is we are presenting the quotes in English or translated into English if the original interview was in another language, and rather than have the person speaking, a quote is spoken by a quote actor. Finding actors has been difficult. I mean, some of these will maybe be professional actors. Queen's University has a drama department that's been quite handy. And then I think also I'll be looking for some volunteers. The original plan, we talked a bit about this with some of the people who teach in the drama department here, and we talked about how to use, what sort of voice for people to use. We pretty quickly decided that asking the students to sort of do fake European accents might be a recipe for disaster and insulting people. So we decided to go for neutral English. But then when I did this sort of test with the students, there is no such thing as neutral English. Depends on where you are. What one person's neutral is another person's accent. And so I think we're probably going to opt more for spreading our web a bit wider and looking for things like postgraduate students at Queen's or undergraduates who are from different countries to speak the voices with a real, say, Bulgarian accent. Also, I'm still casting for the voice of God. Morgan Freeman is not available, and so I'm going to have to find someone or some man or woman instead. Images, lots of images. How to conceive of the images. Really, you need images that sort of illustrate and preferably add something to the meaning of the quote itself. So I've been sort of compiling, so this takes us to the next problem, finding images, how to locate them. You can locate images on the web, but you have to watch out for copyright, which sometimes apparently does not require copyright, but perhaps actually will, so you have to be careful. And then others, you can make them. Some of the teams have been taking photographs when they've been doing the interviews, and they've been passing some of these on to me. The Bulgarian team in particular has been quite good at producing some striking images. And then some, because I've been doing a lot of traveling, once I realized this was coming up, I take my camera and I take lots of pictures of airports and buses and of various ways and places I go to. And then finally, you could say that we edit/fake images. We can use editing. You can create what are deliberately sort of false images, but for striking purposes. And you can fake. I think one of the Welsh team pointed out that one of the images I used, she said that is a Scottish lowland sheep disguised, pretending to be a Welsh Highland sheep. You know, she actually could tell the difference. And I said, well, sheep's a sheep. I'm sorry, I think so we have to be careful. And then finally, how to combine the two. I'll show this in the demonstration. Basically, we're using a content management system, whatever that may be. It's been explained to me. I think this it's a bit more than a database. It's a way of sort of controlling content and files and linking them. I think it's quite useful, and I think one of the main advantages from the people in the computer center is that they believe that they can teach me how to use it so that I will be able to insert the images and files together, which also means that they won't have to do it. I think that'd be one of their main advantages. But it also gives me freedom to do it myself. It means if we want to do things like, say, expand the oral files to the original language at some point, we could do it easily. And so it's a content management system. But then once you have this structure and framework and you've accumulated your images and your voice files and so forth, how do you actually operationalize this? Back to the voice of God. We do require one. I think one of the effects of having to work with individual quotes is you end up with a non-narrative structure. And this has produced a lot of debate in the project. But it does require at least something to set context to explain why the quotes are there. And it is a non-narrative structure. We aren't really telling stories the way I thought we'd be originally. There's issues about how do you locate what you want to find within the website. Opting for really 3 ways in, keywords, text retrieval, and thumbnails. One of the advantages of actually, I should also mention, back to sorry about the quote, one thing I forgot to mention about the quotes, is as well as having the voices, the quotes spoken by actors, my original plan had been you'd have the image, you'd have the voice alone, and no text. And the computer people advised me that normally they like to have text somewhere associated with voice, more as a disability issue, so that people who are hearing impaired can still read what's being said. So we decided to keep the text or the quotes in. This came out as an advantage when it came around to sort of retrieval, because it meant that we had the quotes there, the languages there, and you can retrieve on text as well as keywords. And then finally, an idea of what you might call thumbnails. A colleague of mine did a presentation where he had visual images and little thumbnails are the start of them, and you could select on those. And so this is actually quite easy to do, and so I'm going to have a third way in to the information. And then finally, navigating. Someone goes in, how do they get around once they get into this sort of, some ideas that it's almost like a maze. People enter at different points, depending on what their interests are. They look at the images and hear the quotes they're interested in, and each person can go in a different sort of way. So there's actually literally an infinite ways of seeing the results. But they do need means of navigating. Part of this is little sort sequences, but gradually the people will come to sort of decision points where they can opt for following up one track or another, and also a possibility of just sort of backing up. So you could go down one track, explore it, decide that you've seen enough of that, but you want to go back and look at the other track, and you could back up and go down the second track. And just an escape option, so you can just get out whenever you want to, instead of being stuck in there for infinity. So at this point, I'm going to hopefully move over to a little quick demonstration. So I'm going to, the technology should be working, so I'll jump across. Yep, we're there, okay. This is now, you could sort of say, I wouldn't call it a beta version, I might call it a delta version, perhaps might be a better way to put it. It's not quite as dignified with beta version yet. But it's a working, sort of a work in progress. We've been playing around with some of the ways that some of this may work. First is sort of, when someone comes to the Your Identity's website, once it's gone public, there would be explanations about this existence of this virtual essay, and someone invited to go to it. If they come to it, there'll be some explanation, further explanation, and then they'll be invited to pick a starting point. So there's 3 ways in. The first of these is the keyword search using Boolean logic, which many of us will be familiar with, or combinations of and, or, not on keywords. Probably the final version might have 3 words rather than 2. And the idea there being that one can pick one person is going to be very interested in intimate relationships. Someone else might be interested in a completely different combination of ideas. So let's say you come in, there'll be a list of keywords, and you're interested really in the sense of tradition as it's communicated across generations. And at the moment, I've put up the farmers, at least a working version of the farmers interview. So what we have here is limited to farmers. But so let's say you decide you're going to search on those 2 keywords. So we'll pick out generation, and I'll do just or, tradition, and then click on a quick search. And at this point, we'll see if this works. It did? Okay, it did. Okay, so it works. This is the kind of results you would get. It's sort of a sequence. A different set of keywords would take you to a different place. And here we have the typical sort of format. We have an image, the voice of God there, and then the actual sort of quote from the person's Marek in Poland. And I think I'm going to change this so that when you go to it, it automatically plays rather than having to click on play. You can pause rather than play. But let's click on play and see what happens. This worked.
There is, however, concern about the younger generation being lost to farming.
For now they are here, but as I see many houses will remain empty, the village is depopulated. They would claim that there are additional payments, however, that cannot keep the people in the village. They just run. The young people run from the village to the city. That's all.
And some others have been produced by this. So here we have a second quote, second image. Get a bit slow.
And I like thinking that way. The beauty of it. That nature is beautiful, and you're working with nature and have, see your work grow in the field, because it's nice here. Nature, it's wonderful. Here is my job and my home. I really want to live here forever, see.
Okay. I'll now back up a bit. So that's one way, keywords. The second way to get in is because you can search the text itself. No matter what keywords we create, we can't anticipate someone else will come along and be interested in something we've never thought about. So you can, if I can type it without making it, let's say that someone is really interested in the Common Agricultural Policy and wants to know what our interviewees have said about that. So they type in that phrase, they search, and what we're getting here, well, this is the voice of God, basically, giving context. And then if I go down a bit further, here's a guy called Mervyn.
The result is that farmers' attitudes to the European Union can be considered to be decidedly ambivalent.
I suppose we're probably governed by the Common Agricultural Policy now. And, well, I think we'd be worse off without it. I don't think we'll have the single payment, the single farm payments and all that, although that's going to be phased out probably, isn't it? That affects us, and of course all the regulations, that kind of, they're foisted upon us from Europe.
Okay. So second way in, and then for something completely different, the thumbnails, which at the moment are down as a separate give me a moment. This will be developed, but the idea again would be that a person, whether they didn't want to search logically or for text, would see basically the first image in a sequence about a particular topic. So they could just visually, if they like the look of an image, they can click on it and it would play. So for instance, clicking on that one, and it would come up with a series of sequences like we saw before. At the moment it's just sort of it's expanding the photograph, but it would take you into a particular place in the interview. So you have to pay attention to what the first image is going to be, but it'd be a different way in. So those are the basic sort of idea of how to get in. Once you're in and navigating around this, we have the decision points, and probably, I think the way that I'm going to use for this, just give me a moment. Oop. Maybe I mistyped. Oh. Okay. Again, you'd be working your way through the file, through the images, and you come to a decision point, and this is the way it would be. It would be two images put up against each other, and you could pick which image you're interested in. At the moment, it's sitting on the public sphere, and you would continue on. Or here, you could, if you went to this image, it would have been farmer's tradition. This was sort of one of the sort of splits we had, sort of a design split of the sort of farmers, things about the sense of tradition in the land compared to how they relate to the public sphere. So if I typed in here, instead of farmer's tradition, farmers, it could have gone the other way. So the moment it would start with farmer's tradition, and you could work your way through the items. Or, let's say you're working your way through the farmer's traditional, and eventually you get tired of them, or you get to the end, you can back up, back to the same decision point that you started with, and decide you want to follow the public sphere sequence instead, and it would switch over, and at this point, you're into public sphere, and you end up in a completely different set of images.
Much of the engagement of farmers with the public sphere of Europe is positive.
I think you can sort of see from the images as well, I think we're gradually loosening up with the images. At the beginning, they were fairly, I suppose,
I think we're probably
hackneyed,
part of the European
stereotypical.
that the
but
funding
we're-
we get is one thing that's really vital for a farm our size.
Okay, it's more of a junior. But I think as we're sort of getting more sort of loose with the images, I'm trying to sort of produce more interesting, challenging images, moving more into sort of surreal juxtapositions. Things like bureaucratic documents with what appear to be blood splatters on them. We were downtown, my wife and I were downtown when we were sort of reading some of these, and we happened to be in a 50p shop, and they had some toys, little agricultural toys, and so we leapt upon those and brought them home, and we have a 2.5-year-old child in the garden, and we gave him the toys and then photographed his hands playing with the toys, little tractors. So we're just sort of, using our imagination. So there we are. I think that's where I'll stop at this point. You can see, I can say it's very much a work in progress. It takes time to do all of this, to find the images. There've been a lot of challenges about how to sort of put the structure together, but the basic structure is there now. It's a matter of populating it. I am going to be recruiting voices. So if you feel like you have a godly voice, I'd be interested to hear from you. There'll be auditions for God. And certainly the others, we have quite a good supply of international postgraduate students around the school, and I'm going to be chasing them and asking for a couple of hours of their time. So it's, I think it'll be ready by the end of the year, completely. Probably a beta version will be up and working before then, but it's going to be an ongoing operation for a while still. So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bob.